Hello, and welcome to Caplin Connects, the podcast where we talk about single dealer platforms, trading technology, and everything in between. I'm John Ashworth. In each episode, we'll dive into the trends, tools, and talent shaping the future of electronic trading. Join me as we unpack what's new and what's next. Welcome to Caplin Connects. My guest this week is a man who I'm proud to say is not only a colleague, but a very good friend. I'm delighted to introduce Keith Hill. Keith.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be back here in Caplin, and a certain sense of deja vu coming through the doors earlier on this morning. Luckily not PTSD, but that was previous places I've worked.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Now, I'm going to take you right back to the beginning. Actually, I'm going to take you back to Oxford and modern languages and let you pick up the story from there.
Well, Oxford and modern languages, I can honestly say that when I was a student, when I was an undergrad doing medieval and modern languages, going to work in finance and going to work in financial technology couldn't have been further from the back of my mind. I mean, it just wasn't something I thought about at all. And I think the root of how I got involved in the business was largely a combination of luck, being in the right place at the right time. You've got to remember, this was mid-80s. It was a time when financial markets were expanding. It was a time when the UK was just about to go through Big Bang. So Big Bang 87, 1986 was, well, 1986 Big Bang, 1987 other things happened. But it was a time of excitement in financial markets. And of course, all the firms were recruiting massively. I had no idea what I wanted to do. Being an arts student, being a humanities student, finance wasn't at the top of my list, but a very good friend of mine who was an engineer from Cambridge, very analytical, said, no, you should look at this thing. It's very enjoyable. It's very stimulating. It pays very well. That always helps. And so I applied for a load of jobs in the run-up to finals. And as you might imagine, for an arts graduate, you don't get a lot of response. And of course, it's not email, it's letters. Dear Mr. Hill, thank you for your application. Unfortunately, ... I think that was the origin of the second reason that I actually ended up in financial markets. Because after quite a few of those, you think, okay, what am I doing wrong here? So I know what my competition is. My competition is a load of very, very bright people with PhDs in STEM subjects. And here I am, an arts graduate. I've got to have a different edge. I've got to have a different story. And I think realizing that, number one, learning from your mistakes. What's not going well? How do I change it? And then realizing, well, I can't compete on that side. Why not go on the business experience and entrepreneurship? So when I was interviewing for a few firms, talking about how I'd run a family business after the death of my father when I was at university and had to deal with that, talking about being a tour guide taking American tourists around Europe and having to handle 46 American tourists and a load of money. Yeah, it was a very lucrative thing. Those were, I think, the triggers for some people who were interviewing me to say, this guy is different from the cookie cutter approach. No internship, no knowledge of financial markets. Let's give it a try. And the bank that did that was Goldman Sachs. So having never heard of Goldman Sachs originally, I mean, this was a time when American banks, specifically Goldman's and Salomons, were just coming into the UK in size. It was the deregulation of financial markets, so moving from a broker-jobber model in stocks and gilts into the market maker, or GEMs as they were known, gilt hedge market makers. They needed a lot of people. So one thing led to another. A few very entertaining interviews, both in Oxford, in London, and then they rang me up and said, are you free to fly to New York next week? I just so happened to be. And then a load of interviews in New York, and I found myself probably a week after my finals ended. I didn't even know that I'd passed on a plane to New York to start a 6-month training program at Goldman.
And did you get on that plane with a sense of imposter syndrome, or were you thinking, well, they picked me and I've had goodness knows how many interviews, therefore I must be good for the job and here we go?
Who hasn't had imposter syndrome? I mean, it's one of those things that has only started to be talked about recently because, as one of my former bosses in the bond market said, well, if you don't take yourself seriously, how can you expect other people to take you seriously? I've always gone on the principle of you take the job seriously, but you don't take yourself too seriously. No, plenty of imposter syndrome. What am I doing here? Bearing in mind the fixed income intake of Goldman that year was like 105 people, of whom only 5 didn't have PhDs or MBAs. And that was largely the Brits. Oh, there was a violinist who'd been at the Juilliard School. She didn't have a PhD or an MBA either.
But we can deduce that music might have implied a correlation with maths and some sort of STEM mentality. I mean, had you done some numerate things?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No. Numeracy was not my thing, which is why I was amazed when they said, we're interested in you in fixed income. I had to go and look up what it was. I would imagine something like equities where there's a story involved, but fixed income was not my thing. And as far as this violinist from Juilliard, I don't think she was numerate at all, but she was a fantastic salesperson.
And to what extent did the skills you'd picked up running your late father's business and marshalling eager and intellectually hungry American tourists around Europe translate into sales on the fixed income floor at Goldman?
That's a very good question. Stamina and determination, certainly. Running my father's business, which was a record store, a chain of record stores at Hi-Fi, and realizing that they were in a terrible way financially. He was a lovely man. He was the most generous, kind, eager to please customers, used to do all sorts of things, but not really very financially savvy in the sense that he didn't realize that the era of never knowingly undersold would effectively just eat his lunch for him. So it was a very, very tough time. But learning how to deal with that, deal with the banks, wind that business down, deal with all the little bits that go with business, property law, sorting out leases, all that sort of stuff. That was one hand. On the other hand, taking American tourists around Europe taught me about foreign exchange. So I was the foreign exchange department for the bus, basically, with a big bag of various currencies that people wanted stuff exchanged into. And they had a wodge of dollars.
And I presume you found a way, before you knew what the words were, to charge a healthy commission and levy a healthy spread.
Absolutely right. Bear in mind that when I was doing that job, I'd never been to the US before. It took my first tour to realize that all dollar bills were the same size. And the same color. You just had to look at the number on them. That was a bit of a surprise originally. But no, I worked that one out very quickly. One took a decent spread. It was a very profitable business.
Did you have a buyback product offering as well?
There was no sale or return. But you did learn about selling skills because you had a very basic salary. But you made your money on the add-on tours, Paris by night, London by night, trip round London with the London pub and fish and chips, that sort of thing. And they costed them, there was a fixed amount you could charge for them, but they costed them on a break even of 15 or 16 or 17 people on a bus. And there was 42 passengers on the bus. So you thought, how can I get the maximum number of people to sign up to it? And I devised a scheme in those days, which I thought was quite smart, really. I said to everybody at the start, look, you're coming over to Europe, and these were whistle-stop tours. So this was London, Paris, Brussels, Bonn, Amsterdam, or Cologne, Amsterdam, in a week.
It's Thursday, so it must be Milan.
It was Tuesday, so it must be Belgium. Yeah, absolutely. I think they made a film about that. But I'd say to them, you've got a budget, you've got a certain amount, we've got these 2 or 3 tours throughout the week. Why don't you all sign up to them now and pay me now? Then you're all going on them with your friends. You know exactly how much money you can spend. Invariably, it worked. So instead of having a break even of 15 or 16 people on a bus, you had the entire bus doing those tours. And that was a juicy business.
Okay, I've got it now. I started this element of the conversation thinking that must have been hard work. I now see a gold mine and I'm hugely envious, and well done you.
Yeah, it was great fun. Also incredibly stressful. The most stressful thing. So when going onto a dealing floor, that was where how to handle that stress without literally crumbling became useful.
Can you remember your first trade or sales trade or significant action that made the bank some money?
I can remember a lot of confusion in the early days because the fixed income market, the gilt market was the one that I was working in, was full of jargon. I remember my first trade, there being nobody else on the desk who could pick up the phone, and my boss pointing to me and saying, pick it up. I picked up the phone and it was a client asking for a price. And I remember standing up and calling out for a price in whatever bond it was. And I was so terrified that I was just looking in completely the wrong direction. At one point, there was a silence after I'd asked for the price, and the trader from behind me said, Keith, I'm over here. So I had to turn around and repeat the request. We did the trade. I think it all went absolutely smoothly, but certainly my pulse was probably about 160 at that point.
You mentioned that we're immediately prior to 1987 Big Bang. If somebody walked into the trading floor in those days, other than telephones, 80 by 24 video screens and fax machines. What technology would they see?
They would see, they'd see the small Telerate and Reuters screens, the little green ones. There were computers. There was Lotus 123 spreadsheets. Remember those?
What were they doing?
Just basic things, working out positions. Most of the position keeping was done by traders' assistants, but we had it to try and keep track of the various things that we were doing. They're very rudimentary. The most sophisticated piece of technology that I owned, and I was given on the day I arrived in New York at Goldman's, was my HP12C calculator. I still have it and it still works, but trying to get the hang of reverse Polish notation was always a curious thing.
I ought to say something like other financial calculators are available, but the truth is
there weren't at that time.
And there aren't really.
Yeah. And this is a thing that's 40 years old and is still working. So obviously, hats off to Hewlett-Packard. They made a good bit of kit.
So Goldman, I'm going to tip the wink here, then was followed by JP Morgan.
Goldman was followed by JP Morgan. I only stayed at Goldman's for about 2.5 years. A lot of the American banks retrenched after the financial crisis, the crash, Black Monday in 1987, which was immediately, it was the Monday after the hurricane hit London or the southeast of England in October. So they retrenched a lot. I decided that it was time to move on. JP Morgan came looking for somebody in the gilts area, and I found myself working at JP Morgan, which was a very different style of operation from Goldman Sachs.
In what way? Both American banks to the non-cognoscenti?
Both American banks. I felt that Goldman was more cutting edge at the time. It was more aggressive, less paternalistic, more entrepreneurial. When I started working at JP Morgan, I came across my first experience of build versus buy. So at the time, Mike Bloomberg at Merrill Lynch was just launching his Bloomberg system. And JP Morgan in those days thought, no, we're JP Morgan. We can do this far better than Merrill Lynch. So they built this thing called SARA, which was Systems and Rates Analysis. It was their own marvelous, all singing, all dancing, bond analysis calculation system with a lot of information in it. And after, I don't know how many years it was quietly folded up, dropped into the bin, and they took Bloomberg. And of course, Bloomberg's ubiquitousness in any financial institution in the world has made him what he is today. But it was an interesting time.
And why was that? What was the killer app that Bloomberg had? Was it the data? Was it the chat? Was it a combination of both?
I can't remember if chat was a big part of it in that days. As memory serves, chat came a little bit later. But it was having all that data and the analysis to look at bond yields through history and work out what was cheap and what was dear. I was focusing very much on the long end. I was focusing on insurance companies, pension funds. So I was dealing more with the long end of the fixed income market rather than the short end. But the technology didn't change a lot from when I started at Goldman's, where the most technological thing was really the fax machine, which was this small fridge device that you could load 10 pages into and it would send them overnight for the order run. It didn't change a lot until computers started being used largely for options pricing, and that was probably early 90s, I would say. And that's when I made the move from fixed income into foreign exchange. Wanted to change, wanted to learn more things, and felt that I was stagnating a bit doing what I was doing.
And what provoked that change and what was different? Well, you had foreign exchange experience from your...
Well, I had foreign exchange experience from basically running a small and rather dodgy currency changing outfit on a bus. But I liked the economic story element of foreign exchange, especially as things like emerging markets were starting to become much more relevant, more so than the fixed income. And I don't regret it. I think the foreign exchange market has a vibrancy and a joie de vivre that the fixed income market slightly lacked in those days. So moved onto the foreign exchange floor, found initially it was very confusing, very loud, but very exciting.
Interesting. You've touched a real nerve with the concept of option pricing in FX, because my entree into the market was through the management buy-in of a business whose name was Astragamma, but whose brand name was Fenix. And Fenix, originally pronounced Phoenix, but we lost control of the pronunciation, had become the market standard for option pricing.
Absolutely.
And it had become the market standard because its inventor, a genius called Peter Cyrus, had realised it was possible to do Black-Scholes or at least Garmin-Kohlhagen pricing on a desktop computer in the time it would take to make a sales quotation or a broker quotation or a trader quotation. And what's more, cleverly designed the workflow so it was straightforward to interpolate between premium and volatility and back again. And just as he made the point about Bloomberg's ubiquity arising because of the transparency beget by the availability of data, so it was that the volatility market was created because there was price transparency that beget liquidity. And so it went on. And he also very cleverly gave the software away to the brokers. So the brokers were all quoting, what's your Fenix this, what's your Fenix that. Therefore, all the banks had to price it because even if they had sophisticated pricing systems themselves, they needed to know where the rest of the market was pricing. We won't go down the rabbit hole of debating whether there is such thing as a right price for an option, but it was all about relative value, fair value, and the business was immensely successful because that sense of it having to be a market standard persisted.
But was that a deliberate strategy to give it away to the brokers free of charge? So I'm always interested in how businesses come to those decisions. Was that the plan from the outset?
Absolutely his plan. And once he'd established some sort of credibility and recognition in the market, he then, and whether the details are exactly correct or not is irrelevant, but the principle was that I think he sold the first license to the first bank for $100, then doubled the license until every subsequent sale, until he achieved any price resistance whatsoever, at which point he kept the price at that level because he didn't want to employ salespeople. And in fact, when we inherited the business, I say we, colleagues of mine and I who undertook this management buy-in of the business, there were no salespeople. So it was literally a classic example of viral distribution, and the price was set by the price at which there was said to be no sales resistance in the buying process.
And presumably also at that stage, there was a must-have element of it. So once you've got this core nexus of people who are using it, then everyone uses it. And that's one of the things that certainly I found working on the dealing floor, specifically with Bloomberg. All the foreign exchange people later on had a Bloomberg screen. And it was probably the most expensive chat function in the world because its rich capabilities and its very complicated lack of user-friendliness was brushed aside. It was just used for chat. But with their pricing structure, it was, very, very cleverly done. Everyone had to have it, the Bloomberg system, and it was just for the chat, and largely in foreign exchange.
No, the ubiquity was clear, and of course, one of the things that we were doing then was creating transparency for the tier 2 banks who didn't have, for various reasons, the rock star quants that the tier 1 money centre banks could employ. And of course, the tier 1 money centre banks had their own pricing capability. They rated their pricing ability far above anything that we could do, but still, they had to have it to know where the tier 2 banks and the tier 3 banks were making and taking prices.
Well, I certainly think at that stage of my career, I wasn't using Fenix because I wasn't an options trader. Thank heavens I never got my feet wet trading options or trading anything because it would have been an absolute disaster. But I do remember looking at the early screens and thinking how complicated they were. They seemed to be very detailed, very complicated. And I think if you look at a lot of those original systems, they were designed with an expert user in mind. And that was one of the things about the Bloomberg system. You have to do it this way, and comparing this with that, there's lots of shortcuts, and you became an expert on using the Bloomberg system. If you compare that to the way that technology is going now, it's only over the last 15 years or so, it's been to make interfaces that are much easier to use. You don't need to be a quant or a trader or an options trader to use this thing. And I think that's the direction things are going in. But when I was selling foreign exchange to institutions at JP Morgan, and then when I got involved in emerging markets, because I was posted to Mexico City for just under 3 years, doing everything, fixed income, foreign exchange, we did equity derivatives. Even at that stage, and this was 1997, technology wasn't being used aggressively as part of the regular workflow. It was being used by the quants. It was being used by, obviously, economists in terms of gathering together data and making predictions, but it wasn't part of the sales process at all.
The UI point you make is very relevant. Fenix was very clever in that regard because the complexity around pricing an option we hardly need to describe or enumerate here. but cleverly, the screen was arranged in 3 different coloured bands.
I remember it.
Magenta, yellow and green, I think it was. And one of the bands was where you entered all the contract parameters. One of the bands was where the market data parameters, so what were the depot rates and so on and so forth. And the third band was the Greeks, the output. So it was relatively intuitive for somebody who was intelligent but hadn't been an experienced option trader to actually get somewhere with a software. And something that we, in the course of running the business before we sold it to GFI in 2001, I think it was, we had to take care of a lot of. But it was fun times, and we met some super smart people. I mean, the names, I'll almost certainly miss some out, but there was Jack Jeffrey at Citibank, Craig Puffenberger and Phil Vassan at Credit Suisse, Mark Bobonovich at JP Morgan, well, Chase actually, Chase as it was then, Phil Weisberg, notably at JP Morgan.
My options trader.
Who was the up-and-coming king of options and had a promising junior looking after the volatility database working for him called Neil Penny. 2 people I think we both had the privilege of working with later in our lives.
And of course, Phil then re-emerges in the FXall saga.
In the FXall saga, when he goes off to Lab Morgan to kickstart an unbelievably disruptive model where, lo and behold, banks are being invited to pay commission to access their very customers.
In fact, that was his big criticism of it originally, because after a few years at JP Morgan Mexico, I then moved to the States, to New York, to be product manager for emerging markets. And this was in the run-up to the year 2000. So the dot-com boom was, I can only describe it as heady. It was very similar to the amount of hype that's going on around AI today. Everybody on the foreign exchange dealing floor was talking about .com this, .com that, stock tips this, stock tips that. Also at the time of the TV show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But that buzz and that hype, I think I must have been seduced by it, because when a friend of mine approached me saying, look, he had been approached by a company wanting to launch a multi-dealer foreign exchange platform. And bear in mind, I had no idea that Lab Morgan was working on these things. I was a product manager selling emerging markets products. I thought this was a move absolutely in the right direction, because I'd seen the rather arbitrary and random nature of markup and how that worked at banks for the previous sort of 10, 15 years. And it was arbitrary. If you'd asked if the same client had asked 2 salesmen at an identical price, they'd have got 2 different prices, because the salesman's job was to read the client and to see what would be appropriate margin for that particular size trade on that particular occasion.
I think it's just to interrupt. I think it's also worth, in the timeline of this conversation, noting that the time I got involved with Phoenix, the rock stars in the industry were the quants. And I think you mentioned in an earlier conversation that at the start of your career, the rock stars were the traders.
Absolutely.
We're now in an era, post-Orange County and other minor client bank financial disasters, where suddenly the regulators are hoving into view, and regrettably it's the accountants who become the rock stars, because Basel comes along and suddenly we've all got to start to behave properly.
Well, that's also, if you think about that time, that was the genesis of 2 things. It was the genesis of the global code. So it was the genesis of having a code of conduct that highlighted what was permissible behavior and what was not. And it was also the genesis of an era of competition and transparency. So I remember speaking to the inventor of Currenex, a chap called Larry Wentz, lovely guy, who originally had worked for Citibank. And he went in to see Phil Weisberg at JP Morgan, I'm sure Phil remembers it very well, to pitch the idea of this thing called FXfox. FXfox was the multi-bank platform. It had a handful of banks on it, and it only had 2 clients. Waldron Management was the name of the company that Larry ran. And when I asked him later, why was it Waldron? He said, well, that was the name of my maths teacher at junior school. So that was Waldron Management. But Larry went in to see Phil Weisberg, and Phil basically was almost apoplectic. He said, you mean you're going to charge me to price my clients in competition with other banks? Get out of here. So Larry left with his tail between his legs. And of course, I think little did he know that Phil was working on FXall at the time. And at the same time, of course, Atriax was working with Citi, Chase, Deutsche Bank and Reuters on the same idea. So the idea was clearly of its time. But making that move, and it's quite a bold move, I think, in my career path, from having a stable job at a decent, well-paid organization, emerging markets in JP Morgan, to chucking that in, wife and 3 kids, living in the States, and joining a dot-com startup was aggressive and exciting. And I think it's one of the lessons that I've learned, which is if an opportunity comes up, take it. You can be too comfortable. And if I think of how my career has progressed over 20 or 30 years, whenever I've had an opportunity to do something different, even if it feels very uncomfortable, so moving from a fixed income to foreign exchange, moving from foreign exchange in London to running global market sales in Mexico, to being product manager in New York, to ditching banking and going into this technology space, I don't regret it at any point because you learn new things. And in every job, you can say, I wish I'd known this when I was doing my last job, because it would have made me so much more effective at doing that job, which is the lovely learning process.
There's also a sort of history of science thing going on here where, as in the example of computers being powerful enough to crunch Black-Scholes for option pricing quickly, there's a sense of the old adage, necessity is the mother of invention, but here invention is almost the mother of necessity, because once somebody has some technology, somebody else has got to have it as well. And I'm sort of thinking that whilst you were at FXall in the early days, back at the banks, there was this division between people doing the job as you had done it with telephones, but also people doing it with screens and new technology. And there was conflict, I guess.
There was conflict, certainly to start off with. So we're talking now early 2000s. So this is post 9/11, post the dot-com crash. In fact, actually the day I joined Currenex was the day the NASDAQ crashed. So obviously my timing wasn't brilliant. But the technology driver at the time was very much the single dealer platform. And banks were competing to see who could have the flashiest, the most exciting, the most feature-rich.
Spinning cubes.
Spinning cubes was a little bit later, yeah, absolutely. And, Silverlight, very, very, very computational power, PC-heavy apps. That was the brand marketing of those banks, how to get your name in front of the clients. But a lot of the time, for the general housekeeping trades, price was the main driver from the client's perspective. So understanding what your clients wanted, and you would try and persuade them obviously to go down the single dealer route, but quite a lot of them said, no. For this, I just want a quick and easy price. And I think that's where Currenex had the right idea, although of course our first operating system was PowerPoint. And so as we went pitching it to various clients on the buy side, and they threw up objections, we don't like this, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that, we'd simply go back to the office and change the PowerPoint screens, then present them to the next person to see what was the ideal layout. But even in those days, what I found fascinating about the technology is they still had a very interesting way of looking at user experience. So I remember they got a bunch of people in to look at a prototype screen, and they had a little camera above the screen, and they were looking at people's eye movements to see where people would look. They wouldn't give them any instructions to say, right, log into this thing. And they automatically, a lot of people would look top right or bottom left or wherever it was. Where's your total? It's going to be bottom right. And they developed those things that now we take as standard. Things like the hamburger menu. It's just kind of standard. But that was very innovative in those days. But Currenex, even though it is still around, almost fell on its knees post 9/11. I moved then to Atriax. I saw a user interface that filled me with horror, frankly, in the original Atriax one, but was only there briefly until, as you say, I moved to FXall and oversaw the sales of FXall in Europe, but also saw how feature-rich a system could be, but the importance of the back end in terms of trade processing, so post-trade workflows, because that's what created the stickiness. That's what created the glue, so that clients, especially clients, asset managers with 200 different funds, they would, if speaking to a bank about a single dealer platform, they say, we can't possibly connect our, whatever it was, Murex or whatever system it was, to 5 different bank systems. I mean, it's going to be a nightmare. So we need to pick one and use that as the main go-to so that trades would flow through smoothly. And still to this day, that trade processing side, that post-trade workflow pre- and post-trade workflow is critical.
So where was the power, and how did you do your job as a salesperson, or at least running a sales team? Because we've got over the notion that the banks are having to pay to access their own customers. We're accepting the notion that customers are somewhat price sensitive and they want to shop around. So were you looking to sign up customers directly onto the platform through your own and your team's efforts, or were you working with the banks to at least serve the customers who insisted on doing that, so the banks could keep them as friends rather than lose them altogether? Interested in the sense of where the power was and how you did the job.
I can't think of many instances where, to be blunt, banks came to us when we were FXall or Atriax or Currenex said, we need you at this particular customer.
So they were always trying to push their own single dealer channel.
Absolutely. And there was a huge amount of resistance originally from the non-member banks of FXall, because bear in mind once Currenex was largely out of the way, there were two different camps. And it was a matter of personal pride, because in those days, when you were speaking to a customer, which camp they would go through. But of course, most of the customers in those days had banks who were in both camps. They had some who were original signatories to FXall, they had some who were original signatories to Atriax, and they wanted both. So that was a really tricky one. But it was definitely customer-led. It was customer-led because at that stage, the customers wanted the ability to compare prices, but also deal quickly and efficiently. Now, if you translate that to what was happening in the bank side, in terms of the attitude of the banks, that was the start of the division between e-sales and voice sales. And voice sales, to a large extent, that was the traditional way of doing it. That's where the margin came from. So that's where the money was made. And of course, price transparency, almost by definition, means reduction in margin. There was a lot of hostility towards this electronic business in the early days of the bank. I mean, sometimes even in the banks that were, partners in those businesses, I got the impression on more than one occasion that they would have been delighted had they failed, those multi-dealer platforms. But clearly, they're still here.
Yes, you've made me think of an important actor in those days who I worked with called Fabian Shea. He was running e-sales, and I think he had been doing exotic options globally at UBS. And for some reason, I remember him way ahead of his time preempting this division by making sure that sales credits were equal to the sales desk, regardless of what channel the business had been sought through. So he eliminated that conflict.
He was ahead of his time as far as that was concerned.
Way ahead, yeah.
Way ahead of that. But the sales credits were only one thing. Margin was almost impossible to do electronically because the systems that a lot of banks had to add margin to a client price were very rudimentary. It was a sort of one-size-fits-all. And the sophistication of bucketing and working out tiering and that was still very much in its infancy.
We're zooming around a bit in the timeline, but let's move forward to the late 2000s, the early 2010s. You then made the switch from FXall back into the jaws of a bank.
Absolutely. 10 years at FXall. Was it 10 years? Yeah, it was 10 years at FXall. I was there 2002 to 2012. There were a couple of reasons why I decided to make that move. And I thought that all the things that I'd learnt in the technology space would be well applied to working for a bank. And I think the reason I got offered that job was I'd actually pitched FXall to a chap at SocGen in French, in Paris, in La Défense. And
the modern languages come.
The modern languages. Well, I used it, of course, in Mexico when I was working there, although it was about 1,000 years out of date and 4,000 kilometers out of place. And he obviously thought that having somebody with understanding of technology sales would be useful to work in that bank. And I stayed at SocGen for 7 years, working with a really talented team who were building up a product and getting involved in algos right from scratch.
Not least including Caplin Connects' original interviewee, Stéphane Maret.
Stéphane Maret, he was my first boss at SocGen. And the team at SocGen was very hardworking. I think there was still a certain amount of antipathy between voice and E, but I think that's faded now. But I'm sure there are banks out there where there is still that tension in terms of what constitutes sales. So how can you be a good salesman in foreign exchange if you think that price is the main thing that's driving a client? And several things have really changed over the last few years. One, obviously, clients need more than just price. Price transparency is total, but the development of things like algos and post-trade and pre-trade TCA through independent third-party providers have meant that there is a very viable alternative to just putting 5 banks in competition. The way the market reacts to price information being transmitted through price movements in the market also tells clients that if they're trying to do something large or sensitive, don't just put it into competition. So if you look at the genesis from single dealer platform to multi-dealer platform to back to single dealer platform with execution styles that lend themselves to the particular type of trade that's being done, that's where we are now.
Now, Caplin obviously is in the single dealer platform technology business, so we have a vested interest in agreeing with the proposition you've just laid out.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair to say that that proposition is backed up by the data in the last BIS triennial survey. And I think we're all rather looking forward to the next one, which is due out in December, I think it is. And I suspect that we'll see a continuation of that trend.
I think we will. I think having an execution methodology for clients, understanding how your clients operate is very, very important. And that's one of the lessons that I've learned over the last few years was take time to understand the business. So understand the business that you're in terms of who you're selling to, understand the clients, what are they using the product for, where are they going? What are their fears? But there will always be a need for salespeople to cover clients because a personal relationship and a bridge into the resources of, for example, that bank. So whether it's the technology or whether it's the research or whether it's the credit line, which is very, very important. I mean, one of the problems with multi-dealer platforms where the prices or best prices are always at the top is that there's a temptation just to hit the best price. And sooner or later, you run into a massive concentration of credit. And I think these things are becoming more important to get a balanced view. So yes, I think single dealer platforms, especially not only how they're used by traders in terms of technology, but the tools that salespeople have to be able to quote clients quickly and efficiently with all the information they need in one place is where this is heading. I think anybody who looks at a second-tier bank who's got 7 different systems, which poor old salespeople have to look up credit lines and exposure and past trades and stuff, all of that is going to be consolidated.
I think many people listening to this podcast will know that you then joined the Caplin Advisory Board and were tremendously helpful in getting these sorts of ideas evangelized into the market to the Caplin customer and prospect base. What people are probably less aware of is how, and I will say this, considerably helpful you were to the people within the business who were starting out in their careers, either as developers or project managers, and you gave them a huge amount of your time and experience in really getting them up the learning curve in what foreign exchange and foreign exchange technology was all about. But interestingly, we talked about the technology revolutions that we both lived through to some extent. You're now very recently retired, probably busier than ever and wondering how on earth you managed to fit in all the things that you have to fit in, but slightly missing out on the AI wave. So putting together the things that you've learnt, how would you advise someone coming into the industry now, what should they be paying attention to?
The AI wave, you're right. I think in terms of financial markets, that's something that belongs to the next generation, and I'm happy to leave it with them. That said, I've always found ChatGPT terribly useful for all sorts of things. I think in terms of the next generation, people coming into the business now, I would say to them, as I mentioned earlier, take time to understand the business and ask lots of questions. That intellectual curiosity is top of the list. You won't know everything at any stage throughout your entire career. I'm still learning things about this business. So ask questions. Don't be embarrassed at the start of your career to ask what seems like the silly questions and make mistakes. You will make mistakes. And as one of my former bosses at JP Morgan, Nick Roten, said, when I was a new manager, he said, we expect you to make mistakes. We don't expect you to make the same mistake too many times. Very, very true. That's the understanding. Empathize in terms of, and that's what I've tried to do here and every place I've worked. And I was quite touched when I retired, the number of people who put nice comments, or generally nice comments, on LinkedIn about working with me and my role as a mentor. I've taken that very seriously. I've tried to do it here. But essentially, it's a people business. So try not to make too many enemies. They'll find you themselves. Try not to make too many enemies, and be nice to people on the way up, because you'll probably meet them again on the way down and they'll be way more successful than you are. The third thing I think is embrace change. And that's where I had a problem with some of the banks, where even to this day, there are still some salespeople in the markets who refer to electronic trading as the toy. Guys, get a grip. I mean, this is here to stay. So embrace change, whether it is technological change and change in the way you do things, or whether it is change in the direction of your career. And the last point I would say is always have a plan. I had a plan when I was interviewing for jobs way back in 1986, that if things clearly weren't going well, I need to have a plan to change it. I had a plan when I left JP Morgan to move into Currenex in the technology space, because I was convinced that's the way it's going to go. I have plenty of plans now that I'm retired. But I think if you always look at those 4 elements, understanding, empathizing, embracing change, and having a plan, even when you're covering clients, you can say, okay, what's my strategy here? And that forces you to think analytically about where you're going and where the business is going. Get those things right, you're onto a winner, I think.
Well, Keith, amen to all of that. And I can't think of a better way to end what has been a thoroughly enjoyable conversation.
It's been great having this chat.
Congratulations on a tremendous career. And actually, all of the 80 people who wrote nice things, I can tell you. It's very good to see you again. Thank you so much for being part of Caplin Connects.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning into Caplin Connects. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss what's next. If you'd like to learn more, head over to caplin.com and check out the team behind the show.